better. Welcome everyone in person and virtually, those of you who are joining us online. I am so excited to be here and have so many folks here interested in this topic. It really inspires me and gives me hope to really move this work forward, having so many energized faces in the room that care about this issue. So, I'm an assistant professor in the Agriculture, Food, and Environment program at the Friedman School. For those of you who sort of live here on the Medford campus, we're downtown on the Boston campus doing all kinds of interesting work at the intersections of agriculture, nutrition, health. So if those of you who are interested in research are interested in talking with me after this about research opportunities or ways that you can possibly get involved as an undergraduate in the work we do at the Friedman School, please come talk. I'm happy to get your name and to chat more. So today, enough about that. I am going to share my perspective and some of the work that I've done thinking about how and the impact of incorporating sustainability into our dietary guidelines. So just a little bit about where we're headed. I'm going to give us a sort of large-scale overview of the influence that food and agriculture have on our natural environment. Talk about the potential role of dietary guidelines in promoting sustainability and the sustainability of the food system. And then do a deeper dive into the dietary guidelines in this country with sort of a policy case study based on current or very recent history in the development of the dietary guidelines here, and also some research I've done in this space about the sustainability of our current guidelines. So just to give us a sense of where we stand in terms of the global food system and agriculture. So agriculture and the way we produce food and what we produce has large-scale impacts on our natural environment. So agriculture and food production are responsible for possibly over a quarter of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions globally, up to 70% of our freshwater withdrawals on an annual basis. Agriculture and food production occupy almost 40% of the Earth's ice-free surface. And because agriculture and food are such large land users, in many cases they're drivers of biodiversity loss in particularly sensitive biomes. Here we have pictured the deforestation occurring in the Amazon for crop and livestock production. And agriculture is also a major driver of water quality impairment, so of nutrient enrichment in our waterways. This is an aerial view of the algal bloom, seasonal algal bloom that occurs in Lake Erie, largely due to phosphorus runoff from farm fields. And so agriculture is sort of implicated in a large scale in lots of these environmental issues, so it matters to folks who are interested in environmental studies. And a way we can think about sort of prioritizing and examining the extent to which these impacts are occurring is the planetary boundaries framework. How many folks here are familiar with the term planetary boundaries? Couple? Okay. So the planetary boundaries are a set of essentially thresholds that Earth system scientists have developed to articulate when we might be at a tipping point for different variables that relate to the Earth system. So for example, climate change. The planetary boundary for climate change is 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. That's sort of the tipping point where we could start to expect increasingly erratic and variable and unpredictable behavior of the Earth system. So I bring this framework to the fore because agriculture and food, as we just discussed, are major drivers of us exceeding or being at high risk of exceeding potential planetary boundaries. So we have phosphorus and nitrogen biochemical flows here, climate change, land system change, and genetic diversity, which in part is related to biodiversity loss, and there are other things involved there too. So planetary boundaries are a key thing to consider when we think about the role that agriculture and food system play and how we can think about sustainability. As we start to become at increasingly high risk for breaching our planetary boundaries, effects can feed back into the agriculture and food system. So it's not a one-way, it's not a linear or one-way relationship. So agriculture depends on clean water, healthy soil, predictable, semi-predictable weather, and a great example of, not attributing this to climate change, but Hurricane Florence, we've seen 2 episodes of 500-year floods in a small period of years. It seems like it's no longer a 500-year flood, if that's the case. And farming operations being threatened and increasing environmental hazards in this place because of increasing instability of our climate system, in part. So agriculture is affected by the environment. Agriculture affects the environment. And as we think about moving towards sustainable agriculture and food systems, we have to think about shifting what we produce, how we produce it, and how much we produce it. And I've been talking a lot about agriculture, but this talk is about diet. And so we know that agriculture doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? What we produce, consumers and policies are large drivers of what actually gets produced, how farmers farm, et cetera. So thinking about ways in which we can develop evidence-based policy that drives consumption change toward more sustainable diets is a key lever to getting us toward more sustainable food systems. And I would call this look, a food systems perspective. So we're not just thinking about mitigating the impacts of agriculture on farms. We're thinking of other ways we can intervene in the food system. So where's policy? Yeah, policy, to help drive more sustainable outcomes. So evidence-based policy that drives sustainable consumption change. And one of those policies, I believe, is key in this conversation is dietary guidelines. So what role can dietary guidelines play as we think about sustainable food systems? So to start, because we're not all nutrition students here, what are dietary guidelines? These are foundational pieces of nutrition policy. They essentially, at a very basic level, are guidance to the public from a government on what we ought to be eating. What we ought to be eating to be well, to be healthy, to promote nutrition. In almost all cases, they're developed by a Ministry of Health in a country. I put an asterisk here because the US is actually a special case. Our dietary guidelines are, we'll talk a little bit later about this, but are jointly developed by the Department of Agriculture and our Department of Health. And because they're developed in a country-specific context, they consider the unique social, economic, and nutritional factors of that particular country. So dietary guidelines in Malawi, for example, would look very different than the dietary guidelines perhaps that we have in the United States, because we have very different nutrition and public health issues in those 2 countries. They're science-based. That's something that I'll return to over and over. So these guidelines are based on scientific evidence. And just as an example of what these look like, this is in the United States. You might have seen this, the myplate.gov. This is the consumer-facing messaging for the US dietary guidelines. So essentially, this is supposed to give folks an idea of what it means to have a healthy plate. And this is the actual policy document, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's really long. It's way too much for individuals to process, which is why we have kind of consumer-facing outreach and educational materials like MyPlate. So this is an example of what it looks like in the US. In terms of the sort of scope of dietary guidelines, less than half of countries globally have them. So 83 out of 200-ish countries have them. And something to notice that's not readily apparent, but is the case, they tend to skew toward, at this point, high-income and upper-middle-income countries. So there's a real push in the international nutrition community to help low-income countries develop their own dietary guidelines and develop that nutrition policy. But for now, this is sort of the state of where we are. And these are just countries with dietary guidelines, period, not dietary guidelines that include aspects of environmental sustainability. And I say that because those are very different. So if we think about what a healthy diet might look like, and we think about what a sustainable diet might look like, there's overlap. But when you add sustainability, you add a level and different levels of complexity that's not captured just by population health or individual health today. So the FAO defines Sustainable diets, I'm not going to read this. I'll let you all kind of take it in for yourselves. I'll highlight certain words. So sustainable diets, low environmental impact, focus on present and future generations, so not just current population health. Culturally acceptable, respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, fair and affordable, and optimizing natural and human resources. So that's a much more expansive, kind of holistic definition of what it would mean to have, what it would mean to eat well, in a way. So there are a very small number of countries that have successfully incorporated any sort of sustainability language into their dietary guidelines. The list I have here are Germany, Brazil, Sweden, and Qatar. They are the 4 countries that have guidelines in their official policies. So these policies actually have the force of law. They inform programs. They inform education. There are other countries that have sort of quasi-official guidelines that don't have as much power in a sense. So just to get, and these are just a smattering of the types of guidelines. There are guidelines that apply to all of the different food groups. But you'll see, try to restrict the amount of meat, giving guidance on particular amounts of meat or the kinds of meat you should be eating, eating foods mainly of plant origin, et cetera. So this is kind of an example of what these guidelines might look like if we were to include sustainability. And I'll just give like a shout out to Brazil. If you have never seen Brazil's dietary guidelines and you want to see a beautiful example of what like very comprehensive guidelines that include sustainability are, check out their guidelines. They include environmental, social, and economic sustainability, and they're also beautifully illustrated. So if you're interested, check them out. They're online. All right, so that's dietary guidelines, kind of the picture globally. Now let's zoom into the situation in the United States. Like I said, I'm going to talk about the policy first and recent developments in policy, and then I'll talk about research I've done that examines kind of the sustainability implications of our current guidelines. All right, so the dietary guidelines for Americans. Their purpose is, again, to provide science-based advice for folks aged 2 and older. Now that's actually changing. The current dietary guidelines that are being developed have a focus on kids under 2, in addition to pregnant and lactating women. They include, it's guidance that includes advice for those who are at increased risk of a chronic disease. That's because in this country we have particular issues related to diet and disease, like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera. Our target audience, policymakers, educators, and health professionals in this country. The dietary guidelines inform nutrition programs, which I'll talk about in a second, so that's why policy. And then nutrition educators and professionals who interface with folks in doctors' offices, at dietitians' offices, et cetera. And then they're updated every 5 years. So you may have noticed in the report document I put up, it said 2015 to 2020. So we have a revision cycle of every 5 years. The evidence gets updated, and we have new guidelines. So just a very brief overview of the process of how these are put together. This has actually changed after the latest version of the guidelines. So this is historically true, and there are some tweaks that were put in place. But the main point I want to make with this is this. So at the beginning of a 4-year or of a 5-year phase, the DGAC is chartered. So this is the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. This is an independent scientific committee. These folks are not employed by the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Health and Human Services. They're scientists, and they come together as a group, and they meet for 2 years, and they review all of the new evidence and all the old evidence, and then put together a scientific report. That's this DGAC report that they then submit to the Secretaries of Health and Human Services. Then that report goes out for public comment. So folks have the opportunity to submit comments on what they agree with or disagree with in our guidelines. And then USDA and HHS develop the final guidelines. And they actually have really broad latitude as to what they can include or exclude in the final guidelines. So I say this because I want to distinguish between the scientific process that occurs and the political process that occurs. So the final policy document that we see has been filtered through a political process. And that's important when we talk about sustainability and what happened with the most recent version of the Dietary Guidelines. And then, as I mentioned before, the Dietary Guidelines are implemented through federal programs. So they influence SNAP, which is food stamps, and WIC, which is the program for infants and children, and other nutrition education and nutrition programs here. So let's get to sustainability. So in 2015, the most recent version of the guidelines was being put together. And the committee that came together reviewed the evidence, and they decided to add a chapter to the guidelines on food safety, which had been in the guidelines before, and sustainability. Their sustainability for the first time was included in the scientific report for the guidelines. Why? Well, for the case that I made at the beginning, right? They claim that a significant objective of the Dietary Guidelines since they began in 1980 has been to address food security in this country. And you can't have food security without environmental sustainability because we're increasingly at risk for and vulnerable for all of these, in all these different dimensions I mentioned. So they kind of use this term long-term food security. So we not only need to be thinking about food security and health today, we need to be thinking about the food security and health of the population next year and the year after that and 10 years from now. And we have to include sustainability if we want to develop guidelines that do that. So then they said, therefore, sustainability was in scope. It makes sense to include it in the guidelines, just like it makes sense to include food safety, just like it makes sense to include physical activity, because there are actual physical activity guidelines in the Dietary Guidelines. So why else? And this wasn't an explicit rationale of the scientific committee, but this is why it matters that sustainability is in the guidelines. This is a big part of why it matters. So the Dietary Guidelines influence roughly over $80 billion of federal spending. They influence a lot of money, and these are just some of the folks and the dollars that are influenced by what comes out of the Dietary Guidelines. So whatever goes into the Dietary Guidelines has a big impact beyond consumer education. And it doesn't matter that a lot of people in this country aren't obeying or aren't sort of eating according to the Dietary Guidelines, because it has a huge influence on our food system. And not only is there direct influence here on programs, food industry also responds to Dietary Guidelines. So there have been Dietary Guidelines about salt and saturated fat, and the industry has responded and reformulated products and changed how they do things. So they matter. They matter a lot and can have a big impact in terms of sustainability. So what did the committee find? They had a number of topics and research questions that they examined, and I'm presenting one of their major conclusions, not all of them. It's too much for a 40-minute talk. So their major conclusion about dietary patterns and sustainability. So a dietary pattern is the way you eat sort of over the course of your life, over the course of a year. It's your overall pattern of eating as a person. And so basically what they concluded is that a diet pattern that includes healthy versions of plant-based foods and emphasizes those over animal-based foods tends to have a lower environmental impact and is more health-promoting than the average US diet. So I just want to name that they're not calling out any individual animal-based foods. This is a pretty, actually from my perspective, a pretty tame, some pretty tame and vague language, but it caused a firestorm. And one thing before I move on to the firestorm, just sort of a perspective that underlies why that conclusion makes sense. So on average, so these are environmental impacts in multiple dimensions. So we have greenhouse gas emissions, land use, energy use, acidification, eutrophication potential. On the top, we have plant-based foods up here, and the bars are sort of a range of impacts because this was from a review paper. And then on the bottom, we have a range of animal-based foods. And just to make the point that in multiple dimensions, this is per serving. It's also true per 100 grams. It's also true in other dimensions. Plant-based foods tend to have lower environmental impacts. They have, in many cases, different roles in the diets than in our diets than some animal-based foods, which is why it's important to consider whole patterns of eating. But on average, this is why diets that tend to have higher healthy plant-based foods have a lower environmental impact than those that emphasize animal-based foods. Oh, and I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip that one. All right. So what was the response after this scientific report was published? So there were almost 30,000 public comments submitted in an extended public comment period. If you are a policy nerd like me, that is amazing. That almost never happens to have this level of engagement on a policy issue. I mean, there are a ton of people in this room. It's obviously something that folks care about. There are about 8,000 unique, so this means that there were industry groups and there were civil society organizations and advocacy groups that were rallying folks to submit essentially forum comments either for or against. There was also unprecedented press coverage. So the dietary guidelines, you might imagine, are not very sexy, like they're just not. But when you start talking about sustainability, they get really controversial. And so the press was all over it. In both, pro and against, including sustainability, I included this because there was a full-page ad that was taken out in the New York Times, and I believe the Washington Post too, in support of including sustainability in the dietary guidelines. And there are a number of advocacy groups and individuals and academics here that signed on to this letter urging the agencies to adopt these sustainability recommendations. So what about the political response? So Congress reacted by trying to curtail USDA's authority to include sustainability in the dietary guidelines. There was actually, a rider is essentially a little add-on to a funding bill to tell the Department of Agriculture that they can't include sustainability in the guidelines, even though they have the mandate to sort of include whatever they think is in scope. Excuse me. The Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services and their staff that were working on the dietary guidelines were called onto Capitol Hill to testify. It was very much a dog and pony show. There was lots of sort of grandstanding about like, yes, you don't have the authority to do this, and what is this going to do to my state? And they took a lot of heat. The agencies took a lot of heat for essentially letting the scientific committee do their independent job in the process. Ultimately, what happened was a blog post after the report was put in and the public comment period happened, but before the guidelines were published, the Secretaries of Agriculture and Human Services put up a blog post that outlined that they did not think that sustainability was in scope for the dietary guidelines. They talk about how important sustainability is in terms of agriculture, and we have these great conservation programs, which is true, that address sustainability in agriculture at the farm level, but they thought that they didn't believe that that the dietary guidelines were the appropriate vehicle for a conversation about the environment and about sustainability. Just to have a little sympathy, these folks were under tremendous political pressure, and we don't know what happened, behind the scenes in that process. But they were really under fire for what was going on. And so this is sort of the end of the story for sustainability in the dietary guidelines for the latest version that we have. None of the messaging was included in the policy document. It was just sort of excluded from the scientific report when they made it into the policy document. So what then? So I'm a researcher, and after that happened, I started thinking about, well, what can we do from a research perspective? What more evidence do we need? How can I contribute to this conversation about sustainability of our dietary guidelines? And so I started looking into the literature, this was a couple of years ago, about what had been done specifically in the United States looking at our diets and our recommendations. A lot of work in this has been done in Europe and in other high-income countries, and we sort of adapted some of their findings in the Dietary Guidelines, scientific report, not the policy document. I found as I was looking in the literature that there had been some work done trying to look at the environmental impacts of different kinds of diets in the United States and of the USDA food patterns. So the food patterns, it's sort of hard to see, especially for folks in the back, but essentially what this is different calorie levels and food groups and subgroups. So this is vegetables. We have dark green vegetables, red and orange vegetables, beans and peas, starchy vegetables, laying out for different levels of caloric intake what your sort of recommended target intake should be for different food groups and subgroups if you want to have a healthy diet. And this is what's known as the healthy US style pattern. So there had been some work looking at the sustainability of this healthy US style pattern and a vegetarian pattern and a little bit at diets. But there were some gaps. So no one had really looked at multiple patterns and multiple environmental impacts. So there were folks who looked at multiple patterns and greenhouse gas emissions, or multiple patterns and land use with kind of different assumptions and modeling. And it's important, if you can, to think about multiple environmental impacts because you might have trade-offs. It might be the case that you have a pattern of eating that has lower greenhouse gas emissions but has higher water use. So if we have the capability to look at multiple environmental impacts at once, we can get a more complete sustainability picture of different patterns of eating. And no one had yet looked at the patterns that were eventually recommended in the latest version of the guidelines. So they put forward what's called a healthy US style pattern, healthy Mediterranean style pattern, and a healthy vegetarian pattern. And I'll dive into those a little bit more in a second. So we decided to do some life cycle assessment research. Our objective, so myself, working with colleagues at the University of New Hampshire and Tufts here, decided to assess the environmental impacts of the 3 healthy diet patterns that had been put forth in the latest version of the Dietary Guidelines. So how do we do this? There are a couple different pieces. So we did some research on the diet pattern side. We decided to model 2,000 kilocalorie patterns and also 3,000 kilocalorie level for context. So 2,000 kilocalorie is essentially, it's like the reference level. If you look at a food label, that's the amount of calories that's kind of used as reference, so it's familiar to folks. And we use the higher calorie level to see trade-offs between the amount of calories in the pattern and the differences between the patterns, which I'll explain more in a second. The food groups and subgroups that we modeled, so the composition of those food groups. So we had something like fruit group, and then that fruit group is composed of, for example, 50 different fruits, like apple, peeled, cored, sliced. Really specific, individual, as consumed foods. But what's handy is that the USDA already has that level of detail available on their website because they actually, when they develop those eating patterns, they actually model them and do a bunch of, I'm not going to explain it, but they have to be that specific when they come up with the diet patterns. So we took the actual foods that are modeled in the policy. We didn't have to make any choices about, oh, how much beef do we include or how much pork do we include. It's actually the food that's behind the policy. And these foods are nutrient-dense versions of commonly consumed foods. So instead of having something like French fries, you would have like baked potato, for example. These are the 3 diet patterns we modeled, and I've highlighted in green the essential differences between the patterns. So healthy US is on the left-hand side. Mediterranean is in the middle, has a little bit higher fruit recommendation, has a much higher seafood recommendation. And I want to point out that it has a much higher seafood recommendation without changing any of the other protein categories compared to the US. So it's not replacing meat, poultry, and eggs, it's on top of meat, poultry, and eggs. And there's less dairy that sort of compensates for it, and then less, other calories for other use, which is stuff like table sugar and wine and kind of discretionary fun calories, if you will. So those are the major differences for the Mediterranean pattern. Vegetarian pattern, obviously, doesn't have any meat, poultry, or seafood. It has a small amount of eggs, has much higher consumption of nuts, seeds, and soy products, higher beans, and higher whole grains, because there's protein in grains, especially whole grains, and has higher discretionary calories. So those are the essential differences between the patterns. On the environmental impact side, we use a life cycle approach. We actually, instead of doing life cycle assessments ourselves, we actually aggregated data from a bunch of different databases. And life cycle assessment is an approach that allows us to do what's indicated here. We can quantify along the supply chain of a food, we can quantify the emissions generated and the resources used in the production of that food. So for an apple, for example, we can quantify all along its whole supply chain what the total environmental impact is, accounting for all of these different stages. So we had access to data that actually wasn't the full life cycle because it doesn't exist in food and agriculture. We have very limited data at this moment. We essentially had data that was pre-production to production and pre-production to what is processing. And this is where the majority of environmental impacts in a food supply chain generally occur. So those were the choices that we had to make. In terms of the environmental impacts we looked at, we included 16, but we focused on a subset. And the subset that we focused on were those that were of critical policy importance and of importance to food and agriculture specifically. So climate change, this is water quality impairment in marine and freshwater bodies, land use, water depletion, and particulate matter or respiratory inorganics. This is an air quality indicator. Particulate matter is a criteria pollutant according to EPA. It causes respiratory distress, asthma, et cetera. So these were the impacts that we chose to include. All I'll say here is we combined a bunch of different data sets to do this, to convert and transform data and combine the environmental and nutritional data together. And if folks are interested, we can dig deeper into this during the discussion period. All right, here's what we found. And this is in a paper that was recently published in the Lancet Planetary Health. This is an open access paper, so if you Google this, it will pop up and you can open it, even if you don't have an institutional license. Just to orient us to what's going on here, these are normalized impacts, so the diet pattern that has the highest impact is equal to 100%. So the US pattern is red, the Mediterranean pattern is blue, and the vegetarian pattern is green. And then on our x-axis, we have the 6 impact categories I mentioned. So the first thing to note is that the vegetarian pattern has dramatically lower impacts in 5 of the 6 impact categories. So everything except for water depletion, which ended up being fairly similar. The vegetarian pattern, if I'm recalling correctly, it was 42 to 84% lower environmental impact compared to the other 2 patterns. Water depletion is similar, which I'll dive into a little bit in the next slide as to why that's going on. And then the US and Mediterranean pattern are fairly similar with some key differences. So in terms of water quality impairment, the Mediterranean diet actually had a much higher impact, and that's because of seafood. Because of that additional seafood on top of the meat and poultry that was part of the pattern, the seafood that we modeled was actually an aquacultured species, and there was freshwater impairment to that production. So some interesting trade-offs here between the US Mediterranean diet and the vegetarian diet and the others too. So what about calories? I mentioned we modeled 2 calorie levels. So we found that when you took a 3,000 kilocalorie vegetarian pattern, so you added 1,000 calories to the vegetarian pattern, it still had lower environmental impacts than the Mediterranean and US style pattern, except for water depletion because of those similarities I mentioned a second ago. So that's the magnitude of the difference between the patterns in this case. All right, there's a lot going on here. So we have, again, impacts normalized to 100%. This is called a contribution analysis. So the different colors are the different food groups. And these are still the same 6 impacts. And we have the 3 diets from top to bottom: healthy US, healthy Mediterranean, and healthy vegetarian pattern. So what this shows you is the proportional contribution of a food group to the overall impact in that category. So, for example, for the healthy US style pattern, this purple bar, this is protein, so purple is protein, protein was responsible for 60% of the climate change impact of the healthy US style pattern. So that's how this, this graphic works. So I'll point out a couple things. There's a lot of purple on this slide. So protein is driving a lot of the impacts, particularly for the US style pattern and the Mediterranean style pattern. The impacts are more sort of equally distributed across the vegetarian pattern because 2 reasons. In these patterns, the protein contribution, I noted, animal products tend to have higher ecological intensity. And also, there's more protein foods recommended in these patterns. For some reason, they have higher overall protein food recommendations. So those 2 factors mean that protein is really driving a lot of the impacts in these patterns. The other thing, I said I wanted to come back to water depletion. So red and green are fruits and vegetables. So fruits and vegetables are driving water depletion. That's this bar right here, this 3rd bar. Fruits and vegetables are big contributors to water depletion across the patterns. The patterns have fairly similar amounts of fruits and vegetables in them, so it's not surprising it's similar across the patterns. But this is because fruits and vegetables use a decent amount of irrigation water. And so this has sustainability implications when we think about asking people to eat more fruits and vegetables. They're significant contributors to water use in these patterns. And dairy is too. Dairy is using a decent amount of water. All right. Last graph. So another normalized contribution graph. This instead shows us disproportionate impacts. So on the left-hand side, this is the amount of servings. This is the proportion of servings for the protein group of the healthy US style pattern. So we're just looking at protein and protein foods. These are the servings, and these are the impacts. So if we look at seafood, which is green, seafood is 21% of servings in the protein group. But for freshwater and marine eutrophication, it's 48% of eutrophication, and it's 66% of freshwater eutrophication. So it's a disproportionate impact for the amount of servings that are in the protein group. With red meat is the dark blue bar, 35% of servings, 69% of climate change impacts, 67% of particulate matter impacts, and 60% of the land use. So disproportionately contributing to some of the environmental impacts of these patterns are seafood and red meat. All right, so what does all of this mean? So this means that the patterns that were recommended in the latest version of the Dietary Guidelines, although they might be equally recommended for health, could have very different consequences for the environment and other dimensions of human health beyond nutrition. So air quality impairment is an example. So this is what happens when we don't think about sustainability when we develop guidelines. There could be some serious trade-offs. Fruit, vegetables, and water, I mentioned this already. As we encourage folks to eat more fruits and vegetables, we need to be very mindful about not increasing water stress or water scarcity in areas where fruit and vegetable production occurs, like in California and in the Southeast, where there's already significant water scarcity. So that's something that we should have as part of this conversation in sustainability and diets. And then finally, this emphasis on plant-based proteins relative to, or on animal-based proteins, excuse me, relative to plant-based proteins is driving a lot of the impact differences between these patterns. And that just goes to show that what and how much matters. So if there was a small amount of beef in the environmental or in the dietary guidelines, or a small amount of pork, very small, it wouldn't matter that per steak or per burger it has a higher footprint. The amount matters. So that's why it's important that we think about whole patterns of eating and we compare them and we think about trade-offs. All right, so to wrap this up, incorporating sustainability into dietary guidelines is a key mechanism to promote sustainable food systems and planetary health. I just want to circle back to the policy process and the sort of human side of this. We've seen over the past 3 to 5 years tremendous engagement, you all are evidence, on this subject from industry in response to the push that they got from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, but also from civic organizations and from the research community. There are a lot of folks who are really interested in sustainable diets and sustainable dietary guidelines. An example would be there was recently a workshop that the National Academies of Science put together that I was happy to participate in on sustainable diets in DC, gathering experts from all over the world to talk about what that means. So there's momentum here, and there are several professors at the Friedman School who are really interested in this topic. So again, if you want to learn more, reach out to me after, send me an email. Let's talk. And then just to close, on to the next round. So I said we're constantly evolving the dietary guidelines. So the process for version 2020 has already started. It's modified after the last version. The process has been modified, and they're currently calling for folks to serve on the advisory committee. It's not looking likely at all that we will have sustainability in these dietary guidelines, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't still be thinking about this, doing the research, organizing, and moving forward into the future, because there's always 2025. Thanks.
For a wonderful talk. At this point, we could take some questions from the audience, if anybody has any questions.
Oh, I'm glad we have time still.
Hi, thanks so much. Really captivating talk. I have one question is, you always hear like diversity is correlated with sustainability, right? Diversify your agricultural systems. Is this one instance when diversifying the types of diets would actually not be the best, and that if everybody could eat one certain diet, that would actually be the most sustainable?
Okay, so two ways to answer that question. So different contexts. So in low-income countries, diet diversity is essential for nutrition and public health. It's like a foundational part of improving nutritional outcomes like stunting and wasting and getting folks to be where they're happy and secure and healthy. So diet diversity is key there in a really, really concrete way. It's also key here. The question is just diversity of what? So we could think about, you could think about a diverse diet that just has a ton of different kinds of ultra-processed foods, right? In different food groups. So you have ultra-processed starches and ultra-processed sugars. What are you, I'm maybe not answering your question. Diet program.
Yeah, so you have like the vegetarianism, veganism, or meat-based or Mediterranean, or is it better to have everybody eating just one type of diet program? So instead of what actually is going in that diet, should the system contain many different diets, or is one diet actually the key?
So I might not answer your question again. I'll try. So there's no one diet that's recommended. There are sort of, we don't know exactly what a sustainable diet would look like. We just have ideas about what needs to change. So for example, on average, folks in high-income countries need to eat less meat. We don't know how much less meat. We don't know what a sustainable level of meat consumption is, if there is a sustainable level of meat consumption. So it's not that we need to be telling everyone they have to be vegan or they have to be vegetarian in order to get to sustainability. I think there are multiple versions of diets that emphasize more plant-based foods and less animal-based foods and sort of other dimensions of sustainability. We don't have to push one thing. I think we have to push concepts, and we have to do research on like concepts and what facets of a sustainable diet would be.
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
Given what you said about what and how much matters, how do you suggest using these ideas to promote an education campaign on eating sustainable on a college campus? Advertising 1 beef burger produces times kilogram CO2 is one way. What's a better or another way?
So great question. There are, if you are a student, for example, of online questioner in New England, there's a great institute called Farm to Institution New England that has amazing resources for folks who want to work to promote more sustainable diets. So I would say instead of showing people their footprints, dining services is actually a really key player in innovation in dining services. So, for example, producing things like plant-forward meals. So we don't do meatless Mondays because nobody wants less of something. Like plant-forward is actually a way to talk about eating a plant-based diet or having more plant-based options on a menu that's more appealing than taking something away, for example. So I think there are creative messaging opportunities and menu redesign opportunities that don't eliminate meat, for example, from college campuses, but can emphasize different kinds of menu options and choices. So, yeah. Yeah, Jeff?
Hi. I was wondering if you ever looked into the shift wheels put out by the World Resources Institute, and if, as like a next phase of this research, if we could look at, you know, because we can see the vegetarian pattern had significantly lower impact across different indicators of sustainability, and if you've considered, you know, reducing red meat intake by X percentage.
You mean in terms of doing an analysis?
Yeah, an analysis to inform sustainable diets.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it's done a little bit with the shift wheels. I'm not sure exactly what they were looking at, though, in their research.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the shift wheels, but I'll look into it. It sounds like a great concept. And that's absolutely something we need. So this is sort of a snapshot of what the dietary guidelines, you know, might look like now and the environmental implications. What this doesn't tell us is the net impact of a shift from what we eat now to what is being recommended in different forms or what could be recommended. So that kind of analysis is a little more complicated, but really important because it's important to think about not only in multiple environmental impacts, but trade-offs in economy. So if folks change their food spending, if they shift their diets, there might be other sort of effects that happen that we need to account for, and it takes kind of a big integrated modeling approach, and it's a good idea. It needs to happen. Yeah.
So everyone knows that GMOs are sort of a double-edged sword, and some people think that they're good, some people think they're bad.
Mm-hmm.
Personal opinions aside, from a purely sustainability standpoint, do you think that GMOs are going to end up being worse for the environment in terms of taking away biodiversity, or do you think genetically modifying, especially plants, can help create like more food per square mile and increase efficiency and end up helping sustain food production in the long term?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I'll say to the GMO question, so GM is a technology, and what matters is how we apply the technology. So the technology has been applied in ways that maybe are not, so for example, Roundup Ready corn and soybeans in the United States is part of a management system on farms that's probably not environmentally sustainable over the long term, because weeds are pretty smart and they adapt. Colin can talk way more about this than I can. But so it's part of a management system that's not necessarily sustainable in some cases. But the technology, I believe, has a lot of potential to accelerate breeding so we can address things like drought and disease resistance and whatnot. So it depends on how a technology is applied. I don't think technologies themselves are good or bad. It just depends on how it's applied. So if it's being applied to, for example, fight that, what's that virus in cassava, Colin? brown streak virus, then that seems like a great sustainability application so people can eat and harvest their crops, but it depends. It's complicated.
What's the process for altering or revising the actual nutritional food labels on specific products? And could you ever see these guidelines, these sustainability impact guidelines, going into actual like food product labels?
That's a great question. So the Nutrition Facts Panel, that's the label on food products. It's actually in the process of being revised right now, I believe. They're doing things like making the calorie number bigger and de-emphasizing different aspects of it so folks take away different messages. That is overseen by the Food and Drug Administration. So there's a whole sort of regulatory process that goes along with it. I wouldn't say it's impossible. I think it's a great idea to think about what kind of eco-labeling or sort of sustainability labeling might be able to be incorporated into the panel. But I don't think anybody's having that conversation yet, but it's a good idea. Don't think it's impossible.
So Nicole, I kind of promised at the beginning that you might mention, which you didn't, the study that came out on veganism and why a vegan diet isn't necessarily better. And you didn't present a vegan diet scenario. So I'm wondering if you have any insights as to why what that article said and what were the arguments on one of those 7 categories that would lead someone to say a vegan diet is less sustainable.
So I haven't seen that study, but I'll hypothesize. So vegan diet, so you're eliminating all animal source protein. There is a fraction of the land base that's currently used for agriculture that cannot be cultivated for crop production. So it's marginal land. It might be highly erodible, which means the soil can sort of wash away. It might be super hilly. It might be kind of partially forested. So there's land that exists on Earth that if we're going to grow food on it, it's really only suitable for livestock. It's really only suitable for grazing livestock. That amount of land is much smaller. It would support a much smaller livestock industry than we currently have. So if we were just using marginal land to support meat production, we'd have a lot less meat being produced, but that maybe is part of why the vegan diet could be, less sustainable than something like a vegetarian diet where you're using some marginal land for grazing that couldn't be used otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, and this may be not a very good last question because it's a big one. You talked a lot about production and consumption, but it seems to me that the processes in between are also have enormous impact on both sustainability, environmental change, and not least human health, and distribution being one of them, but also processing and preparation of foods. For example, is it ecologically healthy and sustainable to eat a banana in the middle of winter in New England, as well as stuff like processing, right? Where to eat a plant-based diet or lots of grains, right, depending on how it's processed, has enormous impact on human health. How has your research responded to some of these issues?
Yeah, so other key aspects of the supply chain, I would say that we didn't cover in this research, but I've looked at in other work. So something you didn't mention, but I'm going to mention, is food waste. So food waste occurs throughout supply chain. In this country, it mostly occurs in our households, in retail environments. So we have a lot of control, actually, over how much food we waste. And I did some research with colleagues that found that at the consumer level, we waste about 1 pound of food per person per day. So it's a lot. So there are definitely other aspects of the food supply chain that we need to be considering if we're thinking about sustainable diets. Your point on processing and plant-based foods is a good one. It's a research gap. We need more data, life cycle data on the impacts of processing. But I'll also say that meats are processed too. So meats are processed in a very industrial system, and I wouldn't expect, except for some exceptions that are really energy intensive, that there would be that it would bias the results in a significant way. So.
I would love to take another question. I'm going to encourage those of you who still have questions to ask later. Come up forward. Can we give her another round of applause and thank her for a splendid talk?
Thanks, everyone.
And as is our routine, we'd like to stack the chairs. So if everybody could help stack the chairs. I think I'm not sure where they all were when we came in. So